The knock came on a Thursday evening in late October of 1879, when Oscar Winslow had already resigned himself to another winter of silence, so complete it had begun to feel like a second skin. He had been sitting at his kitchen table with a cup of black coffee going cold in his hands, staring at the knot of wood grain on the tabletop as if it held some message he had not yet deciphered, when the sound came through the door. 3 knocks, deliberate, unhurried. And somehow more startling than a gunshot would have been, because gunshots were a thing the world outside his fence line produced, and no part of that world had troubled itself to reach his door in a very long time. Oscar set the cup down. He listened. Wind pressed against the walls of the cabin, and somewhere out in the dark his horse, a big roan gelding named Hector, shifted in the barn and blew air through his nose. Then the knocking came again. Same rhythm. Patient. He stood, crossed the room in 3 long strides, and opened the door. She was standing on his porch in a coat that had once been fine wool and was now more patches than original fabric, holding a carpetbag in one hand and a lantern that had gone out in the other. Behind her, the Colorado sky was the color of old pewter, and the wind was doing its level best to pull the pins from her dark hair. She had brown eyes that caught the light spilling from his doorway and held it steady, and she looked at him with an expression that was neither desperate nor defeated, which was remarkable given that she was clearly both cold and exhausted, and standing at the door of a stranger's ranch house some 4 miles from the nearest town. "Are you Oscar Winslow?" she asked. He had not heard his own name spoken aloud in so long that the sound of it was briefly disorienting. "I am," he said. "My name is Cora Quinn," she said. "My wagon axle broke on the road coming down from Leadville, and my horse threw a shoe 2 miles back, and I left him with a rancher on the other side of the ridge, a man named Harlan Pratt, who said he knew you and that you were decent. I have money to pay for a night's lodging, and I will be gone first thing tomorrow. I am not asking for charity." Oscar looked at her for a moment. Then he looked past her into the dark, at the line of aspens along his fence that were rattling their last few yellow leaves into the wind. Then he stepped back from the door and held it open wider. "Come in out of the cold," he said. That was the beginning of it. Though neither of them knew that yet, and if you had suggested it to Oscar Winslow in that moment, he would have laughed for the first time in 3 years, and then told you politely that you were wrong. Oscar had turned 32 that past summer, a fact he had marked by eating an extra portion of beans and reading a chapter of the one novel he owned, a battered copy of a Washington Irving collection that had belonged to his wife, Margaret, before she died of fever in the winter of 1876. 3 winters ago now. 3 winters during which he had kept the ranch running with a kind of mechanical determination, feeding the cattle, mending fences, breaking the 2 horses he'd taken on as a training job from a rancher down in Gunnison, and doing all of it without any particular sense that any of it mattered beyond the doing of it. He had not sought company. He had not gone to church. He had ridden into the town of Millhaven for supplies and spoken to people with the efficiency of a man conducting transactions rather than living a life. And then he had come back to the land that he and Margaret had chosen together and worked together, and that now felt less like a home than like a responsibility he had taken on and could not in good conscience abandon. Harlan Pratt was indeed a man Oscar knew. They had helped each other with cattle drives twice and shared whiskey once at a mutual friend's wedding. If Harlan had sent this woman to him, then Harlan had made a judgment that she was trustworthy, and Oscar had learned to respect Harlan's judgments. He built up the fire while Cora Quinn stood near the door and looked around the cabin with the careful eyes of a woman cataloging a space without wanting to seem like she was doing so. The cabin was clean. Oscar was methodical by nature, and the discipline of solitude had only sharpened that quality. There was a table, 2 chairs, a cook stove, shelves with dry goods arranged in order, a rifle on a rack above the door, and a single framed photograph on the mantelpiece above the fireplace. She did not ask about the photograph. "I have salt pork and cornbread from this morning," Oscar said. "You are welcome to it." "That would be very kind," Cora said. She set her carpetbag by the door and her dead lantern beside it and then stood at the fire and held her hands out to it. And Oscar noticed that her hands were red from the cold and that she had a cut on the back of her left hand, not deep but recent, maybe from the wagon accident. "You are hurt," he said. She glanced at her hand. "It is nothing. A splinter from the wagon when the axle went." He went to a tin on the shelf and found a strip of clean cotton he kept for wrapping blisters, which his work produced reliably, and he brought it to her without thinking much about it, and she looked at it in his extended hand for a second before taking it and wrapping it herself with neat, competent movements. "Thank you," she said. He heated the food and poured her coffee and sat across the table from her and ate his own portion, because he had not eaten since noon, and there was no reason to pretend otherwise. She ate with appetite and without apology, which he found he respected. When she was done, she wrapped both hands around the coffee cup the way he had been doing when she knocked, and she looked at him across the table. "How long have you been out here alone?" she asked. He had not expected the directness of it. "3 winters," he said. She nodded once as if this explained something she had already suspected. "Harlan said you lost your wife." "He talks too much," Oscar said, but without heat. "He spoke kindly of you," Cora said. "He said you were a good man who had gone quiet." "He said it the way you say something is a shame." Oscar looked at his coffee cup. "What brings you down from Leadville?" The question changed the light in her eyes in a way that was subtle but present. Something moved behind them, and then she answered him in the even tone of someone who had been practicing evenness. "I had a position there as a bookkeeper for a mining company. The company closed its operations in August. I have family in Pueblo. I was trying to get there before the mountain passes got bad." "October is pushing your luck for the passes," he said. "I know that now," she said, and there was a dry quality to it that was the distant cousin of humor. And Oscar felt something he had not felt in a long time, which was the faint pull of wanting to know what a person would say next. He showed her where she could sleep, which was the room that had been a proper bedroom when Margaret was alive, and that Oscar had made into a spare room out of a kind of inability to sleep in it any more himself, taking his own rest on a cot near the cook-stove. He had not examined this decision too closely. He had simply done it and kept doing it. The room had a bed with a good quilt and a washstand, and Cora Quinn stood in the doorway of it and looked at it and said, "This is more than I expected," with a simplicity that suggested she meant it exactly. "I will have your horse seen to tomorrow," Oscar said. "Harlan's place is not far by horseback. I can ride over and bring the animal back and have the shoe replaced by afternoon." "You don't have to do that," she said. "It is not a trouble," he said. She looked at him for a moment. "You are not what I expected either," she said. He did not know what to say to that, so he said good night and went back to his cot and lay in the dark listening to the wind and the occasional pop of the settling fire. And he did not sleep for a while. And when he did sleep, he did not dream of Margaret for the first time in a very long time, which felt significant and also made him feel guilty in the morning, which was its own kind of complicated. He was up before dawn as he always was, and by the time Cora came out of the bedroom in the gray early light, pulling her hair up with pins and squinting slightly against the lamp he had lit, he had coffee on the stove and was frying salt pork and had cornmeal heating in a pan. She stopped when she saw the food. "You didn't have to do that," she said. "You already said that last night," he said. "I noticed you said it and then accepted the food anyway. I recommend the same policy this morning." There was a pause, and then she sat down at the table. "All right," she said. He sat across from her, and they ate in a silence that was different from the silence he was used to, which was the silence of a man alone with nothing but the land and his own thoughts. This was the silence of two people who did not yet know each other well enough to fill it easily, but who were not uncomfortable in it either, which was rarer than it sounded. "I am going to ride to Harlan's after breakfast," Oscar said. "I will bring your horse back and take the animal to the farrier in Millhaven on the way back. It will take most of the morning. You are welcome to stay and rest." Cora Quinn looked at him across the table with those level brown eyes. "Can I work while you are gone?" "I do not do well sitting." He gestured at the room. "There is not much needing doing. The cabin is kept." "I noticed," she said. "You are very particular." "I am," he agreed. "I could mend harness if you have any that needs it," she said, "or check supplies or anything useful. I am not asking to impose. I am asking because I will go out of my mind sitting in a chair." He considered her for a moment. Then he went to the barn and came back with 2 lengths of bridle leather that had been needing attention for a month, and he set them on the table with an awl and a needle and heavy thread and said, "I have been meaning to get to those." And she nodded and picked up the first piece and examined it with competent hands, and he got his coat and his hat and went out to saddle Hector. The ride to Harlan's took 40 minutes in the cold, clear morning, and Oscar did it mostly in his own head, which was where he usually lived on horseback. But he found that his own head was less predictable than usual, because it kept returning to the image of Cora Quinn, standing in his doorway in the lamplight with her dead lantern and her practical coat and her complete absence of self-pity. And he kept examining that image the way you work a loose tooth with your tongue, not entirely meaning to, but unable to stop. He had loved Margaret fiercely and simply, and without reservation, and her death had broken something in him that he had not attempted to repair, because it had not occurred to him that repair was something he was entitled to. He had gotten up every day since and done what needed doing because that was what you did on a working ranch in the high country of Colorado in 1879, where the land required your attention regardless of your interior condition, and he had found a kind of bleak comfort in that necessity. But he had stopped expecting anything from life beyond the continued operation of it. He had stopped thinking about the future in any terms that included another person. Harlan Pratt was a wiry man of 50 with a gray mustache and the eyes of someone who had spent most of his life squinting into sun and distance. He was in his corral when Oscar rode up, and he did not seem surprised to see him. "She make it all right?" Harlan asked. "She made it," Oscar said. "What possessed you to send a woman to my door at dark?" "Had to send her somewhere," Harlan said. "Nearest place with a decent person in it. You qualify barely." Oscar dismounted and tied Hector to the fence. "Where is her horse?" Harlan led him around to the stable and showed him a small bay mare with a good wide chest and an intelligent eye who was eating hay with the focused contentment of an animal who had earned a rest. The thrown shoe had left one hind foot slightly tender, but not damaged. Oscar paid the farrier in Millhaven 2 bits to set a new shoe while he waited, leaning against the wall of the smithy and watching the sparks and thinking about nothing in particular, which had lately started to feel like thinking about something in particular. He was back at the ranch by noon with the bay mare on a lead behind Hector. Cora came out of the cabin when she heard hooves on the frozen ground, and she went straight to the mare and put her hand on the animal's neck and spoke to her in a low voice that Oscar could not quite hear, the private language of a person and their animal. The mare turned her head and pressed her nose to Cora's shoulder. Oscar stood with both sets of reins in his hand and watched this and felt something loosen very slightly in his chest, the way ice in a creek begins to move in March, a slow and almost imperceptible shift. "She looks well," Cora said. "New shoe," Oscar said. "The hoof is fine. She can travel tomorrow." Cora looked up from the mare. Something moved across her face that was complicated and quickly managed. "Good," she said. "That is good." They put both horses in the barn and came back to the cabin, and Oscar found that the bridle leather had been mended with neat, tight stitches that were better than what he would have produced himself. And the harness was coiled and hung on the peg where he kept it. And there was a smell in the room that it took him a moment to identify as apple, faint and sweet. And he looked at the shelf and saw that she had found the 3 dried apples he kept there and had cooked them down with a little sugar into something in his small iron pot. "I hope that was all right," she said. "I found them and they were going to turn." He looked at the pot. He looked at the 2 bowls she had set out on the table. He said, "It is fine," and sat down. They ate the apples with bread and coffee, and the afternoon settled around them with the particular quality of October light in the Colorado mountains, which comes in low and golden, and warm-looking even when the temperature outside is 30 degrees. And something about that light, and the smell of cooked apples, and the sound of another person breathing in the same room made Oscar feel the absence he had been carrying for 3 years in a way he had not allowed himself to feel it in a long time. Not as grief, exactly. More as the awareness of a space that was no longer entirely empty. "Tell me about Pueblo," he said, because he needed something to say that would not reveal any of what was happening in his chest. Cora wrapped her hands around her bowl and looked at the tabletop. "My sister is there," she said. "She has 2 children and a husband who works for the railroad. She has been asking me to come for a year. I kept saying the work in Leadville was good and that I would come when I could." "And now the work is gone," Oscar said. "And now the work is gone," she agreed. She paused. "I had a husband. He died 4 years ago. Fever." She said it plainly, the way you say a thing you have said many times and have found that plain is the only way to carry it. "We were in Kansas then. I went to Leadville because his brother had a claim there and I thought it doesn't matter what I thought. The claim did not produce what we hoped and his brother went back east and I stayed and found the bookkeeping work." Oscar looked at her across the table. "You have been alone a long time," he said. "4 years," she said. "You 3, she met his eyes. "It does something to you." "Yes," he said, "it does." She looked at him steadily for a moment, and he looked back at her, and there was a recognition in it that was uncomfortable in the way of things that are true. Then she got up and started washing the bowls, and Oscar got up and went to check on the horses because there was only so much truth a man could sit with at one time when he had not practiced it in 3 years. That night Oscar lay on his cot and stared at the ceiling and did an honest accounting of himself, which was the kind of thing he did not usually permit because the results were predictably unwelcome. The accounting went like this. He was 32 years old and he owned 300 acres of good Colorado land and a solid house and a working herd of cattle, and he had been operating on the implicit belief that his life was essentially finished as a living thing, that what remained was maintenance. And now there was a woman in his spare room who had brown eyes and capable hands, and who had been alone for 4 years after losing her husband the same way he had lost Margaret, and who was going to get on a bay mare tomorrow morning and ride toward Pueblo and the mountain passes and the life she was trying to find, and there was absolutely no reason for any of this to affect him. Except that it already had, and he knew it, and knowing it was the most awake he had felt in 3 winters. He was not a man who moved quickly. He had never been. Even as a young man in Tennessee before he came west, he had been deliberate and a little slow to speak, and his mother had called it stubbornness, and his father had called it good sense, and the truth was probably somewhere between those 2 assessments. He did not make decisions impulsively. He did not say things he had not meant. Which meant that he lay on his cot for a good long time and thought about the woman in the spare room, and what if anything he was going to do about the fact that she intended to leave in the morning, and at some point in the thinking he fell asleep, which did not resolve anything but gave him rest, which he needed. In the morning she was up before him, which startled him because he was always up first. She had the stove going and coffee made, and she was sitting at the table with her carpetbag at her feet, already wearing her patched wool coat. She had her hair done and her hands folded on the table, and she looked at him when he came in with an expression that was brisk and prepared, the face of a person who has decided something. "I want to pay you for the lodging and the farrier," she said, "and for the food. Tell me what is fair." Oscar stood in his stocking feet and looked at her. She had her chin up and her jaw set in a way that made it clear she was ready to argue about this. "There is nothing to pay," he said. "Oscar Winslow," she said, and his name in her mouth again was that same briefly disorienting thing. "I am not a charity case. I am a woman who needed shelter for a night and was given it generously, and I intend to pay for that generosity because I am not in the habit of taking without giving back." He looked at her for a long moment. "All right," he said. "The bridal work you did was worth the lodging, call it even." She considered this with the seriousness of someone examining a ledger entry. Then she said, "That is fair," and some of the stiffness went out of her jaw. He poured coffee and sat across from her, and they drank it in the early morning quiet. The sun was just coming up, and it hit the frost on the window pane and scattered light in small stars across the wall. Oscar looked at his cup. Then he looked at her. Then he said, in the way of a man stepping carefully across ice and not entirely certain of its thickness, "The road to Pueblo through the passes. It is not safe this late in October." "I know," she said. "I am going to try the lower road through Cannon City. It is longer, but it avoids the worst of the elevation." "Still 200 miles," he said. "I know that too," she said. He wrapped both hands around his cup. "I am not saying you cannot do it," he said. "I am saying it is a long road to ride alone this late in the year." Cora Quinn looked at him with those level brown eyes and said, "I have ridden long roads alone before." "I know that," he said. "I am not doubting you, I am just—" He stopped. He tried again. "I would feel better knowing you got there safely." She was very still for a moment. "Why?" she asked. It was a fair question, and he did not have a polished answer for it, so he said the true thing. "I do not entirely know, but I would." She looked at him for a long time. Outside, a crow called once from the fence post and then was silent. The stove ticked. Hector moved in the barn. "I have not had anyone say that to me in 4 years," she said finally, and her voice was very quiet. "Anyone who would feel better knowing I arrived safely." Oscar felt the thing in his chest shift again, that slow Isen march movement. And he did not say anything because there was nothing to say that was adequate, and also because he was not a man who had many words for the large things. But he reached across the table and put his hand over hers for a moment, brief and careful, and she let him. And then he took his hand back and they finished their coffee. She did not leave that morning. She sat at the table after the coffee, and there was a silence between them that was different from all the previous silences, more charged. And then she said, "I think perhaps I should wait one more day. The mare's hoof may not be quite right yet." Oscar looked at the window. "That would be the sensible thing," he said, and neither of them mentioned that the mare's hoof was perfectly fine. He spent the day doing the work of the ranch the way he always did, checking the cattle in the lower pasture, splitting firewood, patching a section of fence where the post had gone soft with rot. But he was aware all day of the fact of her presence on the property in a way that made the ordinary tasks feel slightly different. Not easier exactly, but less pointless, as if they were being done in the context of something rather than in the context of nothing. Cora spent the day usefully. She found his sewing kit and mended 2 shirts she found folded in a basket near the stove, shirts with small tears that had been waiting months for attention. She organized his dry goods shelf so that he could see at a glance what he had and what he was running low on. She fed the chickens he kept in a small pen behind the cabin because he had forgotten to mention the chickens, and she had found them on her own and done it without being asked. When he came in at midday, she had made a proper soup from dried beans and salt pork and herbs she'd found in the small tin he kept for that purpose, and it was better than what he made himself, which he told her, and she said, 4 years of cooking only for yourself, you find shortcuts, but having someone to cook for makes you remember the longer way." He thought about that sentence for the rest of the afternoon while he split wood. He thought about the way she had said it, not as a lament but as an observation, as a woman noticing that something in herself was still present and still capable of being used. That evening after supper, they sat by the fire. Oscar brought out the Irving book, not to read aloud, just because it was what he did in the evenings, and he sat with it open, and Cora sat across from him with the lamp pulled close, and she had found a piece of unfinished knitting in her carpetbag and was working it methodically. The domestic quiet of it was something that Oscar had forgotten was possible. He found he could not concentrate on the text because he was too aware of the sound of her needles and the occasional shift of her weight in the chair and the way the firelight moved across her face. "What are you reading?" she asked without looking up from her knitting. Washington Irving, he said. Margaret's book, she said. He went very still. Harlan told you that. Harlan said your wife was a great reader, Cora said. She looked up then, and her eyes were careful and kind. I am sorry for bringing her up. No, he said. It is you do not have to be sorry. He looked at the book. Her name was in the front. I keep meaning to remove it, and then I do not. Don't, Cora said simply. He looked at her. Don't remove it, she said. She was real. Removing it doesn't make the loss less. It just makes her less. Oscar looked at the open book in his hands. He had not cried for Margaret in a long time, not since the first winter, but there was a pressure behind his eyes now that was the near relative of tears. He breathed through it. You are a perceptive woman, Cora Quinn, he said. I have had 4 years alone to think, she said. You learn things about yourself and about other people when there is nothing else to look at. What have you learned? He asked. She considered this for a moment, her needles still. That grief does not go away, but it changes shape. That a person can be sad and also still be alive to the world. That loneliness is not the same as solitude, though they can live in the same house. She paused. That when someone is kind to you after a long time of no one being kind, it is terrifying. He looked at her across the fire. Terrifying, he said. Because you had learned to manage without it, she said. And when it comes back you remember what it feels like to need it, and needing things is frightening. The fire popped and settled. Oscar closed the book. I have been managing, he said, for 3 winters. I know, she said. I could see it the moment I walked in. Everything in this cabin is managed. It is clean and ordered and functional and absolutely without comfort. He looked around the room. He thought he had been doing fine. He thought the cabin was fine. And then he looked at it through her eyes, and he saw it clearly for the first time. The absence of any soft thing, any color, any object that existed for pleasure rather than utility. Margaret had had curtains on the windows, a yellow wool rug in front of the fire, a small glass vase that she kept dried flowers in through the winter. All of those things were gone. He had removed them in the first weeks after her death and had not noticed the removal until this moment. I took her things out, he said. I thought it would be easier. Was it? No, he said. But by the time I knew that, it seemed too late to change anything. Cora set her knitting in her lap and looked at him with an expression that was gentle and direct in equal measure. It is not too late to change things, she said. That is the other thing I learned. He looked at her. She looked back. The fire was warm and the wind outside had settled, and the cabin that he had lived in alone for 3 winters felt different in its bones with her in it, not crowded but fuller, the way a room feels when someone lights a lamp in it that had been dark. How long were you and your husband married? He asked. 3 years, she said. His name was David. He was a good man, not perfect but good. She smiled slightly, small and private. He burned everything he tried to cook, absolutely everything. I used to joke that he could burn water. Oscar felt the smile come to his face before he had decided to let it. Margaret could not abide horses, he said, chose this life and could not stand the primary animal of it. She used to stand outside the barn and talk to them through the fence rail rather than go in. Cora laughed. It was a real laugh, sudden and clear, and the sound of it in the cabin was so unexpected and so good that Oscar laughed too. And for a moment they sat across from each other in front of the fire and laughed about their dead spouses' small particular failings. And it was the strangest and most human and most healing thing that had happened in that cabin in 3 years. She stayed a 3rd day. And then there was a storm, genuine and serious, the first real snowfall of the season, which arrived in the night and by morning had put 8 inches on the ground with more coming. Oscar did not have to suggest that she stay because the storm made the suggestion for him, and he found that he was grateful to the storm in a way that he would not have admitted out loud. He saddled Hector and rode to Millhaven to send a telegram to Cora's sister in Pueblo, letting her know that Cora was safe and delayed by weather, and would be on her way as soon as the road was clear. He did this because Cora asked him to, and because she had no way to do it herself without making the ride in a storm, and the post office in Millhaven was where the telegraph line ran. He paid the fee for the telegram himself and told the operator to send it without waiting for her permission to pay. And when he got back and told her what he had done, she looked at him with an expression that was somewhere between grateful and something else, something warmer and less managed. "You did not have to do that," she said, for what was probably the 5th time since she had arrived. "Stop saying that," he said. "People who do things for each other do not have to. That is the nature of it." She looked at him for a moment. "Oscar," she said. "Yes. You know I have to go," she said. "When the weather breaks, my sister is expecting me. She has a spare room and the children need looking after, and I have promised her." "I know," he said. "I am telling you that so that," she paused, and he could see her choosing words carefully. "I am telling you so that whatever is happening here does not become something we are both pretending is not happening, because I have been alive long enough to know when something is happening." Oscar took his hat off and set it on the table and looked at the hat for a moment. "Something is happening," he said. "Yes," she said. "I do not know what to do with that," he said, "given that you are leaving." "Neither do I," she said, "but I thought it was better to say it out loud than not to." He looked up from the hat. "I agree," he said. They looked at each other for a moment across the room, and the snow came down outside the window in soft white curtains, and Oscar Winslow felt something move in his chest that was not the slow creaking of ice this time, but something more like the first breath a man takes when he has been holding his breath for a very long time. Not relief exactly, more like the remembering of what air was for. "Cora," he said, "would you be willing to have dinner with me in Millhaven, when the weather breaks, before you go, just one evening, somewhere that is not this cabin?" She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Yes, I would like that." The storm lasted 2 more days. Those 2 days had a quality that Oscar could not entirely account for because nothing dramatic happened in them. He did his work. She did what she could to be useful. They ate meals together and talked about small things and occasionally larger things, trading pieces of themselves across the table like careful exchanges, each one offered without certainty of what would come back. She told him about growing up in Missouri, about a father who was a schoolteacher and a mother who kept bees, about the way she had learned to read a ledger at 16 because her father made her help with the school accounts, and she had found she liked the clarity of numbers, the way they resolved into a truth that was unambiguous. He told her about Tennessee, about learning to break horses from an uncle who had more skill than patience, about the restlessness that had brought him west at 24 when the land in Tennessee was full and the land out here was open, and the openness felt like the right thing for the feeling he'd had. "What feeling?" she asked. He thought about it. "Like there was something I was supposed to be doing and I had not found it yet," he said. "I thought it was the land, finding the right land, and then I found it and I built the ranch and I met Margaret and I thought, yes, that was what the feeling was about. This, her, this place." "And now?" Cora asked. He was quiet for a moment. "I do not know," he said, "but I notice the feeling is different than it was a week ago." She looked at him steadily. "Oscar Winslow," she said, "you are a very careful man." "I am," he agreed. "I think I like that," she said. "I have had enough of things that move fast and break." On the 4th day the snow stopped and the sky went blue and hard and cold and beautiful, and the road to Millhaven was passable. Oscar hitched his wagon and drove them both into town because the cold made riding uncomfortable, and he wanted her to arrive at the restaurant warm. Millhaven was not a large town, perhaps 300 people, but it had a proper hotel with a dining room that served actual food, not just beans and salt pork. And Oscar wore his best coat and Cora wore a blue dress she had in her carpet bag, wool and plain cut, but a good color that made her eyes look darker. And they sat at a corner table and ate roasted chicken and potatoes and drank coffee that was better than what he made at home. The proprietor, a stout German man named Albrecht Mueller, watched them with the open curiosity of a small-town man who knew everyone's business, and Oscar could see the man noting the fact of them, that Oscar Winslow, who had not brought a woman to dinner in 3 years, was sitting here with one, and he felt self-conscious about it for about 30 seconds before he decided he did not care. They talked about everything and nothing. She told him about the bookkeeping work in Leadville, about the particular pleasure of closing a set of books that balanced, the aesthetic satisfaction of it. He told her about a bad winter 2 years ago when he'd lost 6 head of cattle to a snowstorm and had to sell 2 horses to cover the losses, and had spent the following spring feeling like the land was against him. And then the summer came and the grass was extraordinary, and the herd rebuilt itself, and he had started to understand that the land was not against him or for him. It was simply land, and working with it rather than expecting things from it was the only way to get anywhere. She listened to this carefully, the way she listened to everything, with her full attention. Most people listened to you while they were composing what they were going to say next. Cora Quinn listened as if your words were the only thing in the room. "I want to say something," she said after a pause in the conversation when the food was done and the coffee cups were in their hands. "All right," he said. "I came to your door because I had nowhere else to go," she said. "And you let me in because you are a decent man and because Harlan Pratt sent me. None of that was romantic or significant. It was just necessity." "Yes," he said. "And now I have been in your home for 4 days and we have eaten together and talked in the evenings and I have not felt lonely once," she said. "Not once in 4 days. I had forgotten what that felt like." She set her cup down carefully. "I'm not saying that to pressure you or to suggest anything beyond what it is. I am saying it because I promised myself I would not be a woman who went through her life not saying the true things when they were there to be said." Oscar looked at her across the small table. The dining room was mostly empty, just an old man reading a newspaper in the corner and Mueller wiping down the counter at the far end. The lamp between them made a warm circle of light. "I have not felt lonely either," Oscar said. "For 4 days I have not felt lonely. I had also forgotten what that was like." "So," she said. "So," he said. They looked at each other. The moment had the weight and the delicacy of something that could go either way. "Pueblo is 200 miles, he said. "Yes," she said. "And your sister is there." "Yes." "And you have promised her." "Yes." He turned his coffee cup in his hands. "How long do you intend to stay in Pueblo?" Cora Quinn looked at him with those brown eyes. "I had intended to stay indefinitely," she said. "I had no other plan." "And now," he said. She was quiet for a moment. "I think I may have found a reason to reconsider indefinitely," she said carefully. "If there is something to reconsider." Oscar set his cup down. He was not a man who moved fast and he had made his peace with that about himself, but he was also not a man who let the right moment pass him by when he was paying attention, and he was paying very close attention. "I would like to court you properly," he said, "if you would allow it. I do not know what that looks like given the geography of the situation, but I would like to write letters. And I would like you to know that I am asking with the intention of it being more than letters eventually, if that is something you could want." Cora Quinn sat very still for a moment. And then she said, "Oscar Winslow, that is the most deliberate and thoughtful proposition I have ever received in my life." "I am a deliberate man," he said. "I know," she said. "I meant it as a compliment." She folded her hands on the table. "Yes, I will allow you to court me properly. I will write back." He drove her back to the ranch in the cold dark, and the stars were out in enormous numbers the way they get in the high country on a clear November night. And she sat beside him on the wagon seat with their shoulders almost touching, because the seat was not wide, and he was aware of the warmth of her through their coats in the cold air. She looked up at the stars. "I forget how big the sky is out here," she said. "In Leadville the mountains crowd it. Out here it just goes." "That was one of the things that made me choose this particular land," he said. "You can see in all directions. I cannot abide feeling hemmed in." She looked at him. "Neither can I," she said. In the morning she packed her carpetbag and brought the bay mare out of the barn and saddled her herself, efficiently and without fuss. Oscar had packed her provisions from his own supplies, dried meat and biscuits and a tin of beans, wrapped in cloth and tucked into a saddlebag she could tie behind the saddle. And she looked at the saddlebag and did not say anything about not having to, but simply said thank you, which he thought was progress. He walked with her to the gate in the morning sun. The snow lay on the ground, but the road was clear and the sky was sharp blue, and the day was going to be cold but bright. She stopped at the gate and turned to face him. She was at eye level with his chin, and she looked up at him with those brown eyes, and he looked down at her, and the moment was as clear and simple and enormous as the sky above them. "I am glad my axle broke," she said. "I am glad Harlan has a big mouth," he said. She smiled, and it was a different smile than any he had seen from her yet. Not the dry, small smile of someone managing a difficult situation and finding the irony in it, but something open and warm and real. It went all the way to her eyes. He took her hand for a moment, just held it in both of his, looking at her. Then he let go. "Ride carefully," he said. "Right soon," she said. She rode out through the gate and down the road, and he watched her until the road curved around the line of aspens, and she was gone from sight. And then he stood at the gate for a while longer in the cold morning air, and the exhale that came from him then was long and slow, and came from somewhere very deep. The kind of breath a man releases when he has been holding it without knowing it for 3 years. He was not, he understood, the same man who had answered the door 4 days ago. He could not have said exactly where the change had happened, or identified a single moment in which it occurred. It was more like the way winter becomes spring, not in one day but in the accumulation of small warmings, until one morning you look out the window and something is different, and you know it is not going back. He went inside and sat at the table where she had sat across from him for 4 mornings, and he got out paper and a pencil, and he wrote her a letter that same afternoon, while the shape of her presence was still in the room, so that it would be waiting for her in Pueblo when she arrived. He wrote 4 pages, which was more than he had written at one sitting since before Margaret died, and when he read it back he found it was clumsy in places and too direct in others, and probably not the kind of letter a more sophisticated man would have written. And he folded it and sealed it anyway, because being direct was not a flaw he intended to correct. He rode to Millhaven to post the letter and came back and did his work, and the days went on. But they had a different quality to them than they had before. There was something in them now that pointed forward. Her first letter came 3 weeks later, posted from Pueblo. It was 4 pages also, written in a neat, precise hand that told you immediately she had been trained by a schoolteacher father. She wrote about the road south, about the cold and the beauty of it, about the Canyon City stretch where the Arkansas River ran alongside the road, and the canyon walls were enormous and red, and the sound of the water was constant company. She wrote about arriving at her sister's house, about the sister, whose name was Nell, and the 2 children, a boy of 7 and a girl of 5, about the husband who worked for the railroad and was away more than he was home. She wrote about what it was like to have family around her again after 4 years of only herself, the noise and the warmth of it, the way the children climbed on her without invitation, and how she had not realized until that moment how hungry she had been for uncomplicated touch. She wrote about him. She wrote about the cabin and the morning light on the frost on the window, and the cooked apples, and the lamp and the fire, and the sound of him walking across the room with purpose. She wrote that she thought about all of it more than was probably rational for 4 days of knowing someone. He read the letter 3 times before dinner and once more before he went asleep on his cot, and when he woke up in the morning it was on the table where he had left it, and the sight of it was the first good thing his eyes found. He wrote back that same day, and so it went through November and into December. Letters every week, sometimes more. He found that he was a better writer than he had supposed, or perhaps it was that he had more to say than he had supposed. He told her things he had not said aloud in years, about Margaret, about the shape of that loss and how it had changed and how it felt different now, about the ranch and what it meant to him, about Tennessee and the young man he had been, and the man he had become, and the man he thought he might still be capable of becoming if he stopped treating his own future as an irrelevant topic. She told him about her days in Pueblo, about helping Nell with the children and the house, about keeping accounts for a dry goods store in town for a small wage because she could not sit idle, about the children who had started calling her Aunt Cora with a familiarity that made her heart do complicated things. She told him about the injustice she witnessed at the store. A Mexican family turned away from service for no reason that was given, and she had said something about it to the owner that had nearly cost her the work. And she had been prepared to accept that cost, but the owner had backed down barely. And she had felt sick about it and kept going back because the family needed the goods, and she intended to be there when they came. He read that letter twice and then wrote back and told her he had had the same experience in Leadville, watching men from the mining companies treat the Chinese workers as something less than men, and that there was a particular kind of ugliness in it that was hard to shake from your sight once you had seen it clearly. He told her he was glad she had said something. She wrote back and said she was glad he understood. The letters were courtship in the most literal sense, two people building the architecture of knowledge about each other, brick by careful brick. And in the building of it, Winslow began to understand that what had arrived at his door was not an accident but something that the world sometimes produced when you had survived enough loss to be ready for it. In January, he wrote and asked if she would allow him to come to Pueblo in the spring when the roads were reliable. She wrote back within the week and said yes, and the yes had 3 exclamation marks after it, which was the first time he had ever seen her write anything with exclamation marks, and it made him smile so wide that Hector turned his head and looked at him from across the corral as if the expression were unusual, which it was. He made it through January and February with his heart pointed south like a compass needle. The winter was hard that year, the hardest since Margaret's winter, long stretches of cold that kept him close to the cabin and the animals, and it had the quality of a test, as if the world were checking to see if he would retreat back into the managed numbness. He did not. He wrote letters and he read them and he tended his cattle and he kept the fire going and he thought about brown eyes and capable hands and the sound of a woman's laugh in a room that had been silent too long. In March, he began to prepare. He repaired the wagon thoroughly, new wheel spokes and fresh grease on the axles. He had the cabin properly cleaned, and then he stood in it and looked at it as if through her eyes, and he drove to Millhaven and bought 2 yards of calico for curtains, blue and white, because he remembered what she had said about the window and the light. He bought a small rug, braided wool in blue and red, and put it in front of the fireplace. He was aware that these were not entirely neutral acts. He was aware that they were the acts of a man preparing not just for a visit but for a possibility. He rode to Pueblo in the 3rd week of April when the passes were open, and the road was dry, and the world was turning green in the lower elevations, with the particular insistence of a landscape that has been waiting all winter for permission to be alive. He made the 200-mile journey in 4 days, sleeping at ranches along the way and paying for the privilege riding Hector and leading a spare horse packed with supplies. He arrived on a Wednesday afternoon and found the address Cora had given him in her letters, a small house on a street of similar houses not far from the railroad depot. He tied up at the post out front and took off his hat and stood for a moment because his heart was doing something noticeable and he wanted to be composed when she answered the door. He knocked. The door opened and it was Cora Quinn in a green house dress with an apron over it and her dark hair loose around her shoulders, and she looked at him with those brown eyes and for a full second neither of them said anything. Then she said, "You came." "I said I would," he said. She stepped back from the door. He came inside. There were children's noises from somewhere deeper in the house and the smell of something baking and afternoon light through yellow curtains. And Cora Quinn stood in front of him in the hallway of her sister's house and looked at him as if she were checking to make sure he was real. He was holding his hat in both hands. He was aware of the hat and of the space between them and of the fact that in 4 months of letters they had built something substantial and real, but that it had all been conducted at a distance, and this was the first time they were in the same room again since she had ridden away through his gate in November. "You look well," he said. "You look tired from the road," she said. 200 miles will do that," he said. She smiled. That open, warm smile that went all the way to her eyes. And then she stepped forward and took his hat from his hands and put it on the hook on the wall and said, "Come and have coffee and I will introduce you to Nell's chaos." And he followed her into the kitchen. He stayed in Pueblo for a week. He slept at the hotel 2 streets over because that was the proper arrangement and Nell was a respectable woman. But he spent his days at the house and his evenings at the table in Nell's kitchen with Cora across from him, and the children intermittently involved. And the husband, a pleasant railroad man named Thomas who was home for the week, and who shook Oscar's hand with the directness of a man who appreciated directness and said, "My wife says you fed Cora when her wagon broke." Good man, and that was all the approval that was required. He and Cora walked in the evenings after supper while it was still light, the long evenings of spring that came on like a gift after winter. They walked along the river, and he told her about the arrangements he'd made on the ranch, and what the spring looked like, and she listened and asked questions with the particular interest of someone who is not just being polite, but actually curious about the world you are describing. He asked her about the children, and she talked about them with an expression that was complicated and beautiful, the expression of someone who has discovered a capacity in themselves they had thought was not going to get used. On the 4th evening, sitting on a bench by the river in the last of the light, Oscar said what he had come to Pueblo to say. He said it the way he did everything, carefully and without decoration. He told her that he had been thinking about the future for the first time in 3 years, and that the future he was thinking about had her in it. He told her that the letters had confirmed what 4 days had suggested, which was that she was the person he wanted to talk to and eat meals with and work alongside and face the difficult Colorado winters with. He told her that he was not going to pretend this was simple given that they had only known each other in person for 4 days and months of paper, but that he had been simple once and had lost it, and had learned that complicated was not a reason to stop. He asked her to come back with him to the ranch, not immediately if she needed more time, but with the intention of it being permanent. He told her he had bought curtains. She looked at him when he said the curtains, and her face did something that might have been about to be tears and then decided on a smile instead. "You bought curtains," she said. "Blue and white calico," he said. "Oscar Winslow," she said. "I know it is a lot," he said. "I know you have your sister here and the children and the work in town. I know Pueblo is—" "Yes," she said. He stopped. "Yes, what?" "Yes, I will come with you," she said. "I have been waiting for you to ask me for 3 months and 2 weeks. I have been answering letters and thinking about blue and white curtains since January." She looked at him with those brown eyes in the spring evening light by the river, and she said, "I did not come all the way to Colorado only to end up living a safe life that I only partly want. I tried that once. It does not suit me." He took her hand. She let him take it, and then she turned her hand and held his properly, her fingers through his, and they sat by the river in the last of the light, and he felt the thing in his chest that had been moving slowly since October complete whatever motion it had been making and come to rest somewhere different than where it had been for 3 years, somewhere warmer and more permanent. He gave her 2 more weeks to settle her affairs and say her goodbyes. He spent those 2 weeks helping Thomas with a fence project at the house and taking the children to the store for candy twice, which made him an immediate favorite, and he talked to Nell, who was a rounder, louder version of her sister and who cried when she said goodbye, even though she was the one who had been nudging Cora toward this outcome for months. They left Pueblo on a Tuesday morning in May, Oscar and Cora and the bay mare and Hector, and a second wagon that Oscar had arranged to borrow from a man he knew in town, necessary for Cora's things. She did not have a great many things, but she had books, more books than he expected, a crate of them which he loaded without comment and which she watched him load with a small smile. "My father was a school teacher," she said. "Books are non-negotiable. "I have one book," he said. "The ratio was already bothering me." They made the road north, and the days were beautiful. The high country coming into its late spring fullness, the aspens bright with new leaves, the creeks running hard with snowmelt, the sky the particular deep blue of elevation. They camped 2 nights along the road, and on the third morning came over the ridge, and the valley opened up below them with Oscar's land in it, the green pastures and the dark line of the tree break and the white of the fence rails and the small solid shape of the cabin with its chimney and its new windows. He pulled the wagon to a stop on the ridge, and they both looked at it. "It is a good piece of land," she said. "Yes," he said. "It is." She looked at it for a long moment. He looked at her looking at it. "It could use more than blue and white curtains," she said. "I am thinking a kitchen garden, and a proper flower bed, and perhaps a whitewash on the barn." "Is that so?" he said. "I am thinking out loud," she said. "Stop me if I am overreaching." "You are not overreaching," he said. "You are thinking about what needs doing. I like it." She turned and looked at him, and the light was very good on her face in the morning sun, and she said, "Oscar, are you sure about this?" He held the reins in his hands and looked at her and felt the solidity of what he was sure of. "Cora," he said, "for 3 winters I was sure about very little. I am sure about this." They drove down into the valley, and she walked through the cabin and stood at the new curtains and touched them and turned to look at him in the doorway and said, "Blue and white calico." And there was something in her voice that was not going to become tears, but was the feeling adjacent to them. "I thought it suited the light," he said. "It does," she said. They were married 6 weeks later in Millhaven at the small Methodist church, in the presence of Harlan Pratt and his wife, who wore her best dress and cried into a handkerchief, and Thomas and Nell, who had made the journey up from Pueblo with the children, who had been bribed with the promise of candy and were reasonably well behaved. The minister was a thin young man, newly arrived from Ohio, who seemed mildly overwhelmed by everything about the West, but who knew the words properly and said them with the right gravity. Oscar wore his good coat and his best hat, and stood at the front of the church feeling something that he had felt once before in his life in this particular configuration, which was the simultaneous terror and rightness of standing in a public place and saying out loud that you were going to do the most important thing a person does. He had done it once and had it taken from him, and had not thought he would do it again, and here he was doing it again, and the terror was proportional to how much it mattered. Cora walked down the aisle in a dress that Nell had helped her finish in the weeks before the ceremony, ivory lawn cotton with small blue flowers worked into the collar, and she looked at him when she came through the door and did not look away until she was standing next to him, and her expression was that open, warm, real smile, and also something more, something quieter and more private, the face of a woman who has made a decision with her whole self and is not afraid of it. "You look beautiful," he said quietly before the minister started. "You look like a man who is about to exhale," she said. He had not thought about it in those terms, but when she said it, he understood it was exactly right. He exhaled. They said the words, and the minister declared them married, and Harlan Pratt whooped from the pew, and his wife shushed him, and Nell was still crying, and the children were asking each other when the candy was coming. And Oscar took Cora's face in his hands and kissed her, and she kissed him back, and it was brief and proper for the church, but it was real. And the world rearranged itself around them in the way it does when something true and permanent happens. The reception was at Harlan's place, which was bigger than the cabin and had a porch they could string a lantern on, and Harlan's wife had cooked for 2 days, and there was music from a fiddle player named Domings who lived on the edge of town and who played with enormous skill and great good cheer. Oscar danced with Cora for the first time and discovered she was a better dancer than he was, which did not surprise him, and she led him through the steps with subtle authority while appearing to follow, which he found he respected greatly. They drove home in the late evening with the stars out, and the summer air warm, and the dark shapes of the mountains against the dark sky, and Cora was beside him on the wagon seat with her shoulder against his arm, and neither of them felt any particular need to fill the space with words because the space was full enough. The ranch became theirs in the way that things become shared when two people work together with the same attention and care. Cora planted a kitchen garden along the south wall of the cabin in the good summer sun, beans and squash and potatoes and herbs, and she put in a flower bed at the front that was not visible from the road, just for the seeing of it from the porch. She kept the accounts for the ranch with the precision of a trained bookkeeper, and Oscar found within the first month that the operation was clearer and more orderly for it, that he had been carrying numbers in his head for years that were better on paper. She rode with him to check the cattle because she had decided to become a competent rider, and set about it the way she set about everything, with methodical intention. She was not a natural, she told him plainly, but she was persistent, and by the end of that first summer she could handle the bay mare over most terrain without incident. He learned her particular qualities. The way she went very quiet when she was thinking hard, so quiet you might think she was asleep in the chair, until she would suddenly say something that resolved a problem that had been sitting on the table for a week. The way she laughed when something was genuinely funny and not otherwise, so that her laugh was worth something. You knew it was real. The way she read in the evenings with the same wholehearted attention she gave to everything, the book propped on the table, and her coffee cooling beside it, and the world beyond the page simply not existing for her. The way she put her hand on his arm when he was troubled and did not ask him to talk about it, just was there, and somehow that was exactly the right thing. He learned her grief too, the shape of it and how it moved. She was not always easy. The late autumn of that first year brought a stretch of gray, cold days that put her somewhere quiet and distant, and he came to understand that October was the month David Quinn had died, and that the anniversary of it had a weight she carried annually. He did not try to talk her out of it. He built the fire up and made the coffee and was present and let her be wherever she was, and when she came back to herself after a few days, she looked at him across the room and said, "Thank you for not trying to fix it," and he said, "You told me once that grief changes shape. I was giving it room." She looked at him for a moment, and then she got up and crossed the room and put her arms around him, and he held her in the cabin they had made together out of the life they had each been carrying alone, and it was a good holding, the kind that has weight and warmth and means more than either person is going to say out loud. The question of children arrived naturally, as it does, in the conversations of a married couple who are paying attention to their life together. Cora had quietly believed, in the 4 years after David died, that children were not going to be part of her story, and she had made a kind of peace with that belief. Oscar had lost an infant son with Margaret, a boy born too early in the second winter of their marriage, and had not spoken of it in years, but he told Cora that winter evening, and she listened with her whole self, and then sat quietly for a while and then said, "I am sorry. I am so sorry that happened to both of you." And the way she said both of you, including Margaret in the grief without being asked, made him love her in a way that was its own kind of new. In the spring of 1881, Cora told him she was pregnant. He was in the barn with a colt he had been working with, a young gray animal that needed patience and time, and she came to the barn door and stood there in the morning light in her practical work dress with her hands at her sides and said, "Oscar, I need to tell you something." He looked at her face and read it before she said the words, and he set the lead rope down very carefully. She said it. He crossed the barn in 4 steps and put his hands on her face and looked at her, and she looked back at him with an expression that was hope and terror in equal parts, the both of them remembering what loss was, the both of them standing in that knowledge and choosing to be glad anyway. "Are you well?" he asked. "I am well," she said. "I feel quite well." "Good," he said. "That is good." He held her then in the barn with the gray colt looking at them with mild interest, and he held her carefully, and with a gratitude that did not have adequate words. He was attentive through the pregnancy in the way of a man who had seen what could go wrong and was paying attention. He reduced her work on the ranch, which she argued about until he agreed that reducing and eliminating were different things, and she could continue most of what she did. He drove her to Millhaven twice to see the doctor, a new physician who had come out from Denver the previous year, and who was thorough and careful and pronounced Cora healthy and the pregnancy progressing well, which Oscar heard, and then heard again on the drive home to make sure he had heard it right. The baby came in November of 1881, delivered by the doctor who had ridden out from Millhaven, with the efficiency of a man who had done this before and took the work seriously. Harlan's wife came to help, because she had experience, and because she had appointed herself something like a grandmother to whatever Oscar Winslow's household produced. The labor was hard and long, and Oscar spent most of it outside the bedroom door because the doctor had made it clear he was not helpful inside and would be more helpful outside. And he stood in the main room of the cabin and listened and held his hat in his hands and talked to the ceiling in the way of a man who is not sure exactly who he is talking to but is talking anyway. When the crying started, the particular thin, urgent cry of a brand new person, he stood very still and let it fill the room. Harlan's wife came to the door. "Come and see your son," she said. "His son. A boy." Oscar Winslow set his hat on the table and went into the room. Cora was in the bed, exhausted and gray with it, but her eyes open and clear, and the baby in her arms, wrapped in the quilt that Harlan's wife had brought as a gift, a good heavy quilt in squares of red and blue. The baby was red-faced and frowning with the expression of someone who has recently been required to do something very difficult and is not yet sure what to think about it. Oscar sat on the edge of the bed and looked at his wife and his son and felt something happen in his chest that was beyond any of the words he had for things, so he let it happen without naming it. "He is healthy," Cora said. Her voice was worn at the edges. "The doctor said he is healthy." "I heard," Oscar said. She looked up at him. "You have been standing outside the door saying things to the ceiling. I was not aware you could hear that." "I could hear everything," she said. The ceiling was not the only one listening. He took her hand and held it and looked at the boy. "What shall we call him?" Cora looked at the baby. "I have been thinking," she said. "I would like to call him James." "If that suits you." "James," Oscar said. He tried it in his mouth. "James Winslow, after my father," she said. "James Thomas Quinn, if you do not mind." "I do not mind," Oscar said. "James it is." James Winslow was a good baby as babies went, which is to say he was loud and demanding and absolute in his requirements, but he was healthy and grew with the consistency of a well-watered plant, and by spring he was sitting up and regarding the world with the same level careful attention his mother gave to things, the same broad-shouldered set that his father had, and the cabin was noisy and full in a way Oscar had ceased to imagine possible. The years went on. They were good years, not without difficulty because nothing is but good. The ranch grew. Oscar took on a hired hand in the summer of 1882, a young Mexican man named Eduardo Reyes who was 18 and serious and extraordinarily good with horses, and who Oscar paid a fair wage and treated with the same respect he gave any man who worked well, a fact that Eduardo noted carefully in the first week, and apparently found notable because he stayed on for years, and proved to be one of the best decisions Oscar had made in the running of the place. There were hard seasons. A drought in 1883 that put real fear into the operation, the water in the lower creek dropping and the grass going brown in August, and they managed it by selling a portion of the herd early and running the remaining cattle on the higher pasture where the creek held, and in the end they came through reduced but intact. Cora sat at the table with the accounts and showed him exactly where they stood, no more and no less, and her clarity about the numbers was steadying in the way that truth is steadying even when it is difficult. There were good seasons. Seasons when the cattle brought a strong price and the garden produced abundantly, and Eduardo trained a pair of horses that Oscar sold for prices that made the account books look very satisfying indeed. James grew into a boy of 4, who wanted to know the name of every animal on the property, and could name most of them before he could read, and who had Cora's directness and Oscar's stubbornness, and his own particular quality of absolute confidence in his own assessments, which made him exhausting and delightful in roughly equal measure. In the autumn of 1883, Cora told him she was pregnant again. He was at the table doing the evening accounts, a habit he had picked up from her, and she sat across from him and said it, and he put the pencil down and looked at her with those blue curtain-lit evening eyes and said, "How are you feeling?" "Tired and optimistic," she said. In that order. He reached across the table and took her hand. "I am glad," he said. "So am I," she said. The second child was a girl. She arrived in the spring of 1884, easier than James had been, with the same doctor and the same efficiency. And when Harlan's wife brought Oscar into the room this time, he was not shaking with the same caliber of fear, because he had been through it once and had a son asleep in the next room to prove it, though the love that came with the sight of his daughter was no smaller for being familiar. Cora named her Margaret. She had thought about it and discussed it with Oscar first, asking whether he would find it painful, and he had sat with the question for a moment, and then said it was the kindest thing she could have thought of and that he would be honored, and that the word honor was not one he used casually. "I know," she said. "That is why I asked." Margaret Winslow had dark hair like her mother and gray eyes like the Colorado sky, and she was quieter than James and harder to read, and had a way of watching things carefully before she engaged with them that suggested she was going to understand the world very precisely. The cabin was well and truly full now. Oscar had added a room the previous year in anticipation, extending the back of the cabin with proper lumber he hauled up from Millhaven, and it made the place larger and more complicated and considerably warmer in the particular way that a house full of people is warmer than the sum of its parts. Harlan Pratt died in the winter of 1884, peacefully in his sleep, which was the right way for a man like Harlan to go if he had to go, and Oscar and Cora attended the burial in the frozen ground outside Millhaven, with James bundled between them and the baby at home with Eduardo's mother, who had come to stay that winter. Harlan's wife was steady through the service with the particular dignity of a woman who has spent decades with a man she loved and knows how to honor him properly. Oscar stood at the graveside in the cold and thought about the moment in his barn 3 years before when Harlan had looked at him with those squinting eyes and made the decision that a woman with a broken wagon and a thrown shoe and nowhere to go ought to be sent to Oscar Winslow, and had been right. He said as much to Cora on the drive home in the wagon with James asleep between them under a blanket. "He changed everything," Oscar said, "by deciding I was decent." Cora leaned against his arm. "You were decent," she said. He just knew it already. By 1886, the ranch had grown to 400 acres by the addition of a neighboring parcel that the previous owner had sold cheap, and the herd was strong, and Eduardo had brought on his younger brother as well, and the operation had a different character than it had in the 3 winter years. It was not just Oscar anymore, not just a man alone doing what needed doing in the absence of any larger meaning. It was a working concern with people in it, and purpose in it, and a future in it that stretched forward in ways he could see and plan for. James was 5 and had begun to follow Oscar around the property with the serious attention of a boy who intends to understand the entire world by direct observation. Oscar let him help with simple tasks, showed him how to check the water level in the creek, how to read a horse's mood from its ears and the set of its head. Cora watched this from the porch sometimes in the evenings and had the expression on her face that he had come to know well, the one that meant she was feeling something large and was allowing herself to feel it without managing it, which was a capacity she had developed and he thought was one of the best things he knew about her. Margaret at 2 was beginning to make her assessments known with increasing firmness. She had Cora's way with words and Oscar's directness, and no patience whatsoever for being interrupted when she was examining something, which made her both difficult and fascinating. Eduardo called her La Jefa, the boss, in a tone of affection and resignation combined, and the name stuck. On a Thursday evening in October of 1886, exactly 7 years after the knock on his door, Oscar came in from the barn at dusk to find the cabin lit and warm, the smell of supper in the air, James sitting at the table drawing horses on a piece of paper with the intensity of an artist working against a deadline, and Margaret asleep in the corner on the braided rug in front of the fire, her thumb in her mouth and one sock half off, with the absolute abandon of the deeply tired. Cora was at the stove, stirring something, and she looked over her shoulder when he came in and said, "Hang your coat, supper is almost ready." And he hung his coat on the hook by the door where her dead lantern had once sat on the floor beside her carpetbag, and he stood in the room for a moment and looked at all of it. The blue and white curtains on the windows, the braided rug by the fire, the books on the shelf, her books and his Irving and the others they had accumulated together over 7 years. The photograph on the mantelpiece, which still had Margaret's picture in it, and next to it a second photograph, a wedding photograph, him and Cora squinting slightly in the bright July sun outside the church in Millhaven, his son drawing horses with his mother's focused intensity, his daughter asleep on the rug with the confidence of someone in exactly the right place, his wife at the stove. The cabin that had been empty and managed and without color or softness or comfort had become so completely itself again that it was hard to see the previous version in it, the way it is hard to see the winter when the spring is full. Cora looked over her shoulder again. "Oscar, are you all right?" "Yes," he said, "I am very all right." She looked at him for a moment with those brown eyes. She had turned 33 in the summer, and she looked like a woman who had arrived somewhere she was meant to be, which was what she was. He crossed the room and stood behind her at the stove and put his hands on her shoulders, and she leaned back slightly against him. "7 years ago," he said, "she stirred the pot." "I remember," she said. "You knocked on my door," he said. "You opened it," she said. He thought about standing at that gate in the November morning watching her ride away, and the breath he had taken, the long, slow exhale of a man who had been holding his breath for 3 winters and had just been given permission to let it go. He had not known then that it was permission. He had not known then what it was the beginning of. "I am glad you knocked," he said. Cora set the spoon down and turned in the circle of his arms to look up at him. Her expression had the warmth and the steadiness of someone who has found the thing they were looking for and has stopped looking, not because they have given up, but because there is nothing left to look for. "I knocked on 3 doors that night," she said. "The first 2 did not answer." He looked at her. "You never told me that." "I am telling you now," she said. 3 doors, and you answered." He thought about that. About the men behind the other 2 doors who had not answered and who were living ordinary lives that did not include this woman and these children and this particular configuration of warmth and noise and ordinary extraordinary goodness. He thought about all the versions of the evening that had not happened, the roads that led to other places. "I will answer every time," he said. She put her hand on his chest over his heart the way she did sometimes when words were not quite sufficient. He covered her hand with his. James looked up from his drawing. "Are you 2 doing that thing again?" he said. Oscar looked at his son. "What thing?" "The looking at each other thing," James said with 5-year-old authority. "You do it a lot." "We do," Oscar agreed. "Is that a problem?" James considered this with great seriousness. "No," he said finally. "It just takes a long time." Cora laughed, that real laugh, sudden and clear, and Oscar laughed with her. And Margaret woke up on the rug and looked around with the betrayed expression of someone roused from good sleep. And the cabin held all of it, the laughter and the warmth and the smell of supper and the sound of children, held it the way good ground holds what is planted in it, with patience and depth and the absolute intention of keeping it. Outside, the Colorado night came down over the valley with its enormous stars, and its cold clarity, and its mountains that had been there before any of them and would be there after. And inside, the light was warm and the fire was steady, and the 2 people at the center of it had found their way to each other across 3 winters of solitude and 4 years of grief, and 200 miles of mountain road. and had built something that was worth the distance, and the waiting, and the knock on the door that had changed everything. Oscar Winslow put a log on the fire that night after the children were asleep and sat in the chair by the hearth where Cora sat across from him with her book and her cooling coffee and her presence that was so fully part of the room it was impossible to imagine the room without it. He sat there and he looked at her and she looked up from the book and looked back at him. "What?" she said. "Nothing," he said. "Just looking." She gave him the small private smile that was different from all her other smiles, the one that was specifically for him. Then she went back to her book. He sat with his coffee and the fire and the night sounds of the ranch, the occasional shift of horses in the barn, the far-off sound of a coyote, the creak of the cabin settling, and all of it was the sound of his life, his actual living life, the one he had stopped expecting to have and had been given anyway, by a woman with a dead lantern and a broken axle and the courage to knock on a stranger's door. He breathed in and breathed out, and the breath was easy and full and went all the way down. In the spring of 1887, they planted an apple tree at the edge of the kitchen garden. Cora had ordered it by mail from a nursery in Denver, a small bundled thing that arrived wrapped in burlap, and they planted it together on a March afternoon that was cold but clear, Oscar digging the hole and Cora unwrapping the root bundle with careful hands. James stood nearby offering opinions about the placement. Margaret sat in the dirt approximately 2 feet away and was doing something with a stick that was intensely important to her and that no one else was invited to understand. They put the tree in the ground and Oscar filled the hole while Cora held the trunk steady, and when it was in and the soil was packed around it, she stood back and looked at it, this small future thing, this patient promise. "It will be 5 or 6 years before it bears fruit," she said. "I know," Oscar said. She looked at him. "We will still be here," she said. It was not a question. "We will still be here," he said. "I will be bringing you apples until I am too old to carry them, and then I will send Eduardo." She smiled at that. Then she put her arm through his and they stood together looking at the small bare tree in the cold March ground. This thing they had planted for a future they intended to inhabit together, and it seemed to Oscar a good and proper way to mark what they had, which was everything. The apple tree grew. Slowly, as apple trees do, adding its rings in the quiet way of growing things that are in no hurry because they have time. By the summer of 1892, it put out its first real crop, not large but genuine, and Cora picked the apples in September with James, who was 11 now and tall for it, and Margaret, who was 8, and brought her absolute opinions to the grading of apples just as she brought them to everything. They cooked them down in the big iron pot and the smell of it filled the cabin and went out through the windows into the September air, and Oscar came in from the cattle and stopped in the doorway and breathed it in. Cora looked up from the stove. He did not say anything. He did not need to. She knew what the smell of cooked apples meant to him, what it had meant since the first night, since the October evening 7 days into knowing each other, when she had found 3 dried apples and cooked them down because they were going to turn. And he had looked at the pot and the 2 bowls and sat down at the table of the life he was going to have. She smiled at him across the kitchen, his wife of 11 years, the mother of his children, the keeper of his accounts and the planter of his apple tree, and the person who had knocked on his door on a cold October night, when 3 winters of silence had made him into something less than fully alive. He hung his hat on the hook and came inside. The door closed behind him. The fire was warm. The apples were sweet. And the exhale that had begun that November morning at the gate, when he watched her ride away and felt the first movement of something returning to him, that exhale had become a breathing life, full and easy and deep, a man in the country of his life, home in all the ways a person can be home.